Today, to learn more about human connection, I'm talking to Michelle Johnston, an expert in the field of connection and also an expert in leadership. Michelle is an executive coach and management professor at Loyola University New Orleans, focusing on leadership and business communication. And she's a leadership expert, helping leaders achieve results through meaningful connection. And this is something that I very much relate to. So I was really curious, actually, Michelle, to talk to you today, and very much looking forward. And what I also find interesting and not surprising at the same time is that your research shows a clear link between the quality and level of communication in a company and positive financial performance. And as I just heard, I've been actually the first outside of your group of family and friends and close people who has been able to read your book, The Seismic Shift in Leadership, which is actually officially released on February 22nd of 2022, which, as I told you already, I really enjoyed reading it. There was so much recognition. Michelle, thanks so much for being here today with me and talking with me about this book and about connection. I'd love to start. Obviously, I read your introduction, but people listening to this and watching this, I'd love to ask you to share with me the story, how you got to writing this book.
I literally felt like I got hit by a lightning bolt. Yes. It was in 1 year. I kind of was just doing my thing. I'm a professor in the College of Business, teaching my courses. I was coaching leaders, just kind of not really thinking, just doing my thing. Mm-hmm. And then 3 of my executives that I was coaching, and I usually have a roster of about 15 chiefs, executives that I coach from different industries, different titles. And so these 3, one was a woman, 2 were men, different industries, different titles, and all 3 lost their jobs within a year. And that's never happened. Usually when an executive coach is brought into an organization, it's because that leader is a high performer. It's like a stamp of approval, like you are a rock star, we're investing in you. Yeah. So I was really surprised at the results, and I was heartbroken. I felt horrible. Like, what could I have done to have helped them more? I was their coach. Yeah. And so when you begin any coaching process, at least I do, I begin with a 360 feedback, qualitative interviews. So I have these, I don't have one with me to show. They're really thick data reports of just all this rich qualitative data, so that the leader knows how other people perceive them. I think one of the best leadership quotes is, when you are in a leadership position, you are held hostage by how other people perceive you. Yeah. And so that 360 is just showing how everyone else thinks, or what they think your strengths are, your blind spots, your opportunities for improvement, what success looks like. It's just really rich data. So I went back to all 3 data books. I thought, okay, first I got to start with the data. Was there something in there that I didn't see? Is there something common among all 3 of these leaders? And it jumped out at me. And the reason why it jumped out at me, Julius, is because the comments that the direct reports told me was, we can't trust this person. Yeah. We can't trust this person. We don't know who they are. They're kind of fake. Who are they? There's a wall up. Yeah. So whenever a leader loses trust with his or her team, they're no longer seen as a leader. That's the essence of leadership. Yeah. You know, you have trust from your team and they're willing to follow you. They're motivated to follow you. And okay, so there was that lack of trust, because of something that a wall was up, in authenticity, kind of fake. And then I realized why I don't think I was the very best coach at that time to them, because I had a wall up in the classroom, in the leadership classroom. I had this mask, I call it the mask of perfection. Yeah. So each of these leaders, and then so was I, we were all trying to be somebody that we weren't, thinking that that's what success looked like. And that's what they expect of you as a leader or as someone teaching the class. Yeah. Yes. And that's when I was like, oh my goodness. And I was so lucky because I get, leaders, if you go through executive coaching and you're fortunate enough to get that 360 feedback, that might happen once in your career, maybe twice. But as a faculty member, I get evaluated every semester by my students. So I was so fortunate in a way, although it was painful, I'd already gotten the feedback like, who is this person? Yeah. I see her in the hallways and she seems to be a nice human being. But in the classroom, she's like, rules with an iron fist and thinks that I have to be so strict and so authoritative, which is what I thought it took to be successful. So I was lucky that I'd already gone through it and realized, whoa, if I'm going to get tenure, if I'm going to be a chair, which I am now, I've got to pivot and figure out how I can be me. And I finally, and it took a lot of courage, Julius. I don't really know why. I look back and it's kind of strange when I look back, but I thought, okay, I've got to go in the classroom and just be authentically me, which is a little bit energetic and positive and nurturing and supportive and all of these characteristics that I didn't think were going to be successful in the business classroom.
Yeah.
And so I went in and then a couple of years later, I got Faculty of the Year, which was so validating that I really could be me. So that journey, losing those 3 leaders and what was going on with me, that's what prompted me to write this book, that I had to get the message out there so that others wouldn't fall and wouldn't fail.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said. I think, or I'd like to trigger you a little bit, because you said that you had to find you. I personally, I don't think it's about finding you. You were you. What I imagined was the difficulty was showing yourself and showing all of you and just showing up as who you are instead of what you think the world wants of you. Is that correct?
Totally.
Yeah. Hey, another thing, when I started the book, and actually it was on the first, not the first page, but basically when the book started, from the first page, you struck a chord with the book dedication, because you dedicated it, the Seismic Shift in Leadership, to the city of New Orleans, which is, oh, that's interesting, where you don't have to be perfect. And that really resonates with me. And I know that giving up perfection is one of the key insights that you've gained in this research, and building on the connection with yourself. But can you tell me more about this book dedication in relation to New Orleans, and especially in relation to not having to be perfect? Because I think that's a very critical element.
Well, thank you for even noticing. I love it that you noticed it. Yeah, I was a corporate brat growing up. So my story is one of moving around every 2 years and trying to fit in. And so I lived in lots and lots of cities, from Washington, D.C., New York, Detroit, Nashville, Memphis, Tampa, Birmingham, I mean, the list goes on. And even when I went to college, my family kept on moving. Yeah. And so I guess at that point in my life, I was just so used to trying to fall in line, with whatever, how they dressed, how they spoke, what their traditions are, what their culture was. And then when I got to New Orleans, and I had thought I had seen most of the country, and I called my parents, I said, how could you have kept this city from me? This city just grabbed my soul. Yeah. Because it was just this acceptance of individuality. Being perfect and perfectly coiffed and having a perfectly manicured yard is not really cool in New Orleans. Yeah. I mean, there's music in the corners, there's art everywhere. You're not supposed to be a cookie cutter of everybody else. Yeah. And then teaching at Loyola, which is a very diverse university. And that's what I loved, being in a classroom where the students didn't even feel like they had to end up looking like one another. Different hair colors, different ethnicities. You could be a jock, you could be tatted up. It didn't matter, in this unbelievable acceptance. And I had never lived in a place like that. Yeah. And it really did help me just be me. I'll give you a funny story. Yeah. We experienced a hurricane this past hurricane season. It was Hurricane And we had a catastrophic power failure. So the city didn't have power for 2 weeks. And so serendipitously, my daughter was a senior in college and needed to go on a college tour. So we just took off and went and visited colleges and tried to make lemonade out of the situation. In any case, 2 weeks later, we come back. And I love my house. It's uptown New Orleans. It's super old. It's a great neighborhood. And I'm pulling up in the driveway thinking, oh gosh, how bad does the refrigerator smell? What do I have to do, right, to kind of get back? And I look up at my neighbors who have a second floor, their roof had a hole in it. And so it had flooded and the furniture had gotten wet. And so I don't know how other people would do it in other cities, but in New Orleans, they just started throwing their furniture off their balcony into the street and sidewalk, and it would just splat. And I was just looking up like, do you really mean to be doing this? And the furniture just started splatting on the sidewalk. And I knew that furniture was going to stay there for weeks because we didn't have trash pickup. And you're in this city with splatted furniture on the sidewalks. And you just kind of have to, there's nobody you can call. You'd have to throw up your hands and say,
it's a great example of imperfection right there.
Totally. Like what can you do? You can't control it. You just have to accept it. So it's a city of acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great story. Hey, the seismic shift in leadership, you write about, this shift is actually a shift from one of leadership based on power to leadership based on connection. And actually, this is, as you shared already in the introduction, was your aha moment from seeing these 3 clients of your coaching, where they're basically, even though they're high performers and everything, they don't meet the standards and they lose their job. They were trying to be someone which they were not. We talked about this a little bit. And because of this, there was no real connection. You also mentioned that, especially in current times, COVID-19, why is it now even more important that we show up as ourselves and that we make real, authentic connections? And how can we do that, especially in times where we're communicating mostly like this?
Absolutely. So I started writing this book pre-COVID because I was seeing what started with those 3 clients losing their jobs because they were trying to be somebody they weren't. They also had been trained to use that authoritative leadership style, which was one of power and control.
Yeah.
They ruled with an iron fist, but ultimately they created cultures of fear.
Yeah.
So that's why they lost the trust in the people. Their people didn't know them, and they were kind of scared because they ruled with an iron fist. And I think that for years and years and years, we could have argument. You and I could talk forever about, was that ever effective? Probably not, but that's what the leadership style was for years and years. My father worked for General Motors, which is why we moved around all the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, the stories that he came home at the dinner table every night of the fist pounding and the vice presidents not even knowing anybody's name and just yelling. And I mean, that's how a lot of leaders were brought up, thinking that is how you ruled. Yeah. So I saw that, and then I saw that it got you to a certain level because those personalities were big drivers, and they were achieve, results at no matter what cost. Yeah. So they would get to a certain level, but then I started seeing how they would ultimately get pushed out of the organization. Because if you're going to have a company that truly wants to be innovative, and what company doesn't, you have to survive, right? Then as a leader, you have to create an environment of safety. We talked about safety earlier, of psychological safety, so you can take risks and speak up. Yeah. And these were cultures. And these were cultures of fear. Okay, so you have that contrast. And then that's when I realized, whoa, it's all about connection now. I'm seeing it. So I was kind of in that transition, seeing that finally, it was the leaders who were showing compassion, who weren't doing all the talking, who were listening more, who considered themselves servant leaders. And that's what I wanted to write about. And then I was about to send off my manuscript to the publisher, and the world shut down. Yeah. And here my entire book was on connection, and the whole world was about to be disconnected. So I used that, as a trained researcher, I used that opportunity to go back and learn more from the leaders I interviewed about how in the world they're doing this.
Yeah.
And here's what I found, that what leaders used to think about, well, the old style of leaders who were authoritative, they would walk through, say that this was the marketing department, and they would walk through the marketing department usually with their heads in their phones, thinking about what they need to accomplish that day, not even lifting their head up and saying hello to people. And they would go to their corner office and come out occasionally. And it was not a very relational leadership style, right? But you could get away with it when you went to the office every day and had the corner office and you were still in this big position of power. Right.
Yeah.
And now we have this. Yeah. And all of a sudden the leaders have to care about you as a human, and the dog that just jumped in your lap, and the baby that's crying, and the spouse that ran through the.
Yeah, you can't deny it. There's no hiding anymore. Yeah, that's a great point.
There's no hiding anymore. And so those leaders who could actually, or not who could, who had an interest in their people as humans, not just workers. And that's the seismic shift too, is the vision that a leader has of who his or her people are. If they see them as workers and just workers and results, no, this is a human revolution. Yeah. I really think we are in a human revolution. Yeah. That leaders have to see their people as full human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. It's much needed also. Yeah. So I want to go into the research methodology, basically your approach, because the book has 3 parts about the fundamental part that human connection has in the context of our professional lives, basically. First, it's the connection with ourselves, then the connection with our team, and then the connection with our organization. And for this, you've conducted interviews with leaders of businesses in North America, South America, and Europe, 18 leaders in total. And you've asked them all these questions to provide examples and stories of how they did or did not successfully connect with themselves, with their teams, and with their organizations. So obviously there's a database which is hugely interesting and full of anecdotes, of which I've enjoyed many in your book. Could you please share maybe 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 striking examples that you came across during these interviews that really opened your eyes, that you thought, oh, that's something?
You are going to love this, Julius. I think this was the best example of them all. So I didn't have I didn't handpick these 18 executives knowing that these are who I was going to interview. I started with a couple who I knew were really good at connection. And then I would end the interview and I would say, because they were all CEOs and presidents, and I would say, can you think of a president or CEO who embodies connection or who has struggled with connection that you would recommend that I interview? So that's how I went about it.
Yeah.
And so one of them said, oh, you've got to interview Jim Mora, who at the time he had just gotten fired from being the head football coach at UCLA. And before that, he had been the professional NFL coach of the Seattle Seahawks. And before that, of the Atlanta Falcons. He started here in New Orleans, which is why people knew his name, because his father, Jim Mora Sr., was the head coach of the New Orleans Saints NFL football team. Yeah. So that's how this all began. So I interviewed Jim, and what an interesting guy. He wants to write a book on leadership. And at the time he was just on ESPN Sports Center on the weekends, no longer coaching, and he missed it so much. Yeah. And I said, well, tell me, which area of connection, as you just said, those levels, did you struggle with connection with yourself because your father was an NFL coach? Did you feel like you had to be him? He goes, no, never struggled with that. I said, did you struggle with connection with your team? He goes, oh my gosh, no. We loved each other. My players knew I loved them. Yeah. He goes, I struggled with connection with the organization. And let me give you an example. Oh. He said, I was coaching the Atlanta Falcons. We had a Monday night football game. It was the weekend. I had a free weekend. And so I was up in Seattle, where I'm from. He said, I played football at the University of Washington, the Huskies. My college roommate was hosting a radio show, and he asked if I would be on it. And we were cutting up. He said, Michelle, we were having so much fun. And at the very end of the radio show, my college roommate, the radio show host, said, Jim, if the University of Washington head football coach position ever came available, would you be interested in it? And Jim said, interested? That's my dream job. He said he was just kidding. It was all good fun. But by the time his plane landed in Atlanta, the owners were on the phone. The players were in the locker room. He said he knew his time there was over. He got fired because he was so in that moment disconnected from the fact that he was representing the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah.
And to go on air and say he wanted to be the coach somewhere else, it wasn't good for their brand. So
Which might have just been banter as it was, but still he was unaware of the implications of it in that moment. Yeah.
Totally. He let ego get in the way, and he forgot that he was representing not even just the organization, but the entire fan base. So then after he flew back and had to face his players and the owners who were all very unhappy with him, he then had to go on Monday Night Football. And I don't know, that Mercedes-Benz Superdome or the Dome in Atlanta, maybe 85,000 people. Mm-hmm. He said they were screaming such awful language at him. They had effigies. He said it was horrible. He said it was just, he ended up losing 30 pounds. I mean, it was just a horrible point of his life. And I said at the very end, I said, well, so Jim, do you believe in my theory of connection? He said, believe in it, Michelle. He goes, as you can see, disconnected leaders fail.
Yeah.
I said, boy, is that a great quote. And he goes, well, you know what? The good news is, I said, you're the only leader who actually gave an example of failure as a result of not connecting. Yeah. He goes, look, I want to be vulnerable, transparent, honest, and I learned from my mistakes. So what's beautiful is just 2 months ago, he became a head coach again, and he's the head coach of the University of Connecticut, and he is in heaven to be able to have that opportunity with his players. But he went through a lot of growth and development, and he now knows that he's the ambassador and the brand of the University of Connecticut.
He has to stand before them. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one of my favorites. Another one that I found really interesting, the way that we talked about that I know Ruth Godian, and she was just named one of the top 50 thinkers, management thinkers. I mean, that's such a big honor. Yeah. So she and I are in this group together called 100 Coaches of the Top Global Executive Coaches. And we're on these calls together. And we were in a virtual annual meeting almost 1 year ago. Mm-hmm. And on the call were a bunch of CEOs who are part of our organization, but they can't join in on our Monday calls because they're leading companies. They can't just hop in, whereas we're all executive coaches helping each other. They're leading. So this once a year they come in and they give speeches to us. And I met the global president of Kind snack bars, the kind of granola nutty bars, Kind, Kind. Yes. And his name is Juan Martin. And he was talking about his company and his leadership, and he exuded kindness over Zoom. I didn't know how it was possible. It was palpable. And so I reached out to him afterwards. I said, I would love to interview you for my book. And he said, absolutely. And I learned his story. Mars ended up, it's a private company, Mars, M&Ms and Snickers, pet food. They bought Kind bars. It was an acquisition. And it was so important to them, considering the name Kind, that the Mars family, who's still very much in control, in charge, involved in the company, to look around the organization and to find a leader that represented that. And they found Juan Martin, and he had been in this corporate, upward trajectory, incredible. He was in charge of Africa and Europe, the pet food, the candy bars, doing incredibly well. And he said this wasn't necessarily the best opportunity, on paper for his career, but he realized that was his leadership style. He was one of those compassionate, kind leaders, and that he realized he could do great things. And so the Mars family members convinced him to take on this brand. And now, what I couldn't believe in my interview, Julius, I said, so are you trying to tell me that when I interviewed him, he was about to get off my call and go to his annual eval with the board and the president. I said, so how are you evaluated? I said, it's the number of Kind bars you sell. And he said, no, Michelle. He's in Barcelona, Spain. No. That is one measure. He said, I am evaluated on acts of kindness,
Ha,
because that's the brand. And
that's
our
amazing.
goal was 250 million acts of kindness last year.
Yeah.
Said we didn't reach our goal, but we're going to go for it again this year. And so how beautiful is that alignment? Because that's what connection with the organization is alignment. Are you a leader who is living the values of the company so much that other people want to follow in your footsteps, right?
It's a perfect example of alignment. Yeah, it's amazing. And I love the scoring metrics that they have. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I want to come back to what you've said earlier, because you shared about how your family moved around on average every 2 years to a different city. And there's a quote that I've taken from your book: if you hide pieces of yourself, you're creating a barrier between you and those you interact with. And I think that's very true. And I think people underestimate the importance of this, of actually showing up and showing yourself. And because you were always trying to fit in, so to speak, because you moved around, I read that some of your friends actually called you out as being fake, because you're just trying to fit in and look like they did, instead of being your true self. So why is finding and being yourself so critical for connecting with other people? I mean, you know from experience, from personal experience, by having gone through this and having been to some extent unable to connect or unable to connect with people, or limitedly connect with people because of this.
Yeah, I have a couple of examples from my book as well, and from students in my class. So I realized that perfection equals disconnection, because if you think you have to be perfect, that usually means you have to hide parts of yourself that aren't perfect.
Yeah.
And that hiding those pieces of yourself is what creates that wall and creates disconnection. So I'll give you a student example. I now have the process that I bring my clients and my students through to connect with themselves so that they can fully show up as humans, as leaders, is owning your story. Yeah. And that's what I had to do. And that's what I have all of my students and leaders do. I had to sit there and say, what pieces of myself am I not sharing with others that is creating the sense where people think that I'm fake and that they don't really know who I am? Yeah. And it was because I just, if you, Julius, if you said, hey, Michelle, so good to meet you. Oh, where are you from? I never knew what to say, because I had a hometown, but I only lived there for 3 years. So I would try to find this commonality. If somebody said, oh, I'm from DC, I'd say, oh, I'm from DC too. But then I couldn't go any further in the conversation because I didn't grow up there. Yeah. So after a number of those conversations, I ended up just putting a wall up, and I didn't talk about it. Because people are like, did your dad run from the CIA, or was he with the CIA, or was he running from the government? You know, there are all these suspicions. So I just didn't talk about it. And because I didn't talk about my story, I didn't talk about where I was from. I tried too hard to find, to be like everybody else. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So that just didn't work. So I spent a lot of time owning my story, realizing that I needed to be able to tell my story, or else other people are going to make up false stories or think that I have to tell my story.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Tell and so story.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell the story, otherwise people will create this story for you.
Which usually is false, right? And so I'll give you 2 examples. So I sat down and worked hard on being able to articulate. If somebody says, hey, Michelle, where are you from? I wanted to be able to answer that. And so now I easily say, well, I was brought up in a corporate family. I was born in DC, but we moved every 2 years. Then people can relax. So now they don't think that I'm from one place. And I describe who I am, and they might say, where did you go to high school? And people want to fit you into a box, right? Sure. But as long as I'm able, and then I was able to tweak, because so often the scripts going on in your head negatively affect how you interact with the world, which was happening to me. Right. And the scripts in my head were saying, I don't have a hometown, I don't have a story to tell, so I'm just not going to talk about myself, and I'm just going to be like them. Yeah. That doesn't work, right? So I had to work on that script, that it's okay. I mean, by moving around, I really learned to be resilient. And adaptable, and I love new things, and I love adventures, and I love new cities. So it's not a bad thing. I don't have to be ashamed, embarrassed, and hide that part of myself. Owning it is crucial. Yeah. So that was huge for me. So I had to first do it, and then I'd make my students do it. And I had this student, this is a powerful story. He stood up and he said in class, he was a freshman in the College of Business. This was a number of years ago. And he stood up and he said, I got to tell you all, I'm going to share with you my story that I've never shared with anybody outside of my close family. He said, I'm from Honduras, from a very poor city in Honduras. My family was poor, so poor that my grandparents not only lived with us, but I shared a bedroom with my grandmother. Mm-hmm. He said, only my closest friends knew that. I wasn't going to come to the United States, to New Orleans, to Loyola, and tell people that. He said, but my grandmother died this year, and it made me realize I wouldn't trade those years for anything. Yeah. It made me who I am today, and I'm so grateful. Yeah. I still get chills just telling that story. That is because he had been of himself, because he was so self-conscious, thinking that he would be judged, but yet by owning it and saying, this is me, it makes people relate to him even more.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, and it invites people in to do the same and to open up as well, to get past the discomfort, which is where the growth happened. Another quote, by the way, that I really, really like. Well, I think we'll get to that later. Thanks for sharing these examples. It's really beautiful. Connection is either built or destroyed by how we communicate. And everyone communicates differently. And to successfully communicate with other people, we need to understand our strength and blind spots as a communicator, as you have said in your book, and tailor our communication to the preferences of our audience. I really like this part about the blind spots. So what can we do to find out our blind spots? Obviously, apart from 360 feedback, are there other ways that we can do, how we can learn to communicate better?
I have a great story for you. Yes. So one of my clients, who truly is, his name is Pete November, and he's in my book.
Yes.
And he's one of the best leaders that I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And when I was first hired to work with him, he was new to the organization. And I was told to help him with his executive presentation skills, because this particular company puts on massive leadership events where the executives need to be on stage with the microphone like this, speaking to thousands of people. And so you really have to get good at your executive communications. So they brought me in to help him. And the first time he went up on stage, I was there in this massive convention center in the way back. And I'd already gotten to know him as a human. And I already had him I already knew he took my communication preference profile. So I knew what his communication preferences were, but I hadn't had an opportunity. I did not help him with this speech at all. This was like the first kind of a case study. This was the first piece of evidence I saw. And he got up and was somebody I didn't know. He was trying to be the CEO who had just gone before him. He used the same template for PowerPoint. He followed exactly how the CEO spoke, but they had very different communication styles. So the CEO was a brilliant speaker and communicator, and he was all about content, data, graphs, stats, because that's what drove him as a communicator. That's what he preferred. And it worked for him because that was his personality. But Pete is high people, all about relationships, and he's high action, all about results. So he's not high content, data, all of the graphs. So he was presenting in a way that made him feel uncomfortable because it wasn't who he was. And so he didn't come out from behind the podium. He didn't bring his personality to the table at all. It was very flat. And so I went behind the stage afterwards, and all I said to him, you'll find this interesting, Julius, all I said to him was, Pete, who was that? And whenever he and I give presentations together, and we do occasionally, he will tell the room of people. And then Michelle, my executive coach, came backstage and said, you were horrible. I didn't say that at all. All I said was, who was that? because it wasn't Pete.
Yeah.
And so what we did is now we've modified all of his communication. We've modified his presentation so that he begins with a beautiful story, a story of a customer, a story of a patient, maybe a self-deprecating story. If he's talking about the power of making mistakes, he'll begin with a story of him making a $20 million mistake. And so because that plays into his personality. And then at the very end, he does a call to action because he's all about results. So what do I want you all to do? I want you to go back and find inefficiencies, make changes. It's time to disrupt. That's Pete's personality. Yeah. So the next time after we went through this process and I went and saw him on stage, I was in the back like, yes, that's my guy. Yeah. That's him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, because it's about, and this is actually, you talk about the alignment with the organization at the third part of the book, but obviously this is the alignment with yourself and your communication style. It's very important. Yeah.
Yes. So again, this is based on all of my interviews, and I had this brilliant graduate assistant, Christina Jackson, and we sat down with all this data and did a content analysis to figure out, okay, so I knew, I came up with the theory, or at least the lightning bolt zapped the theory in my head, that it's about connection with yourself, connection with your team, connection with the organization. But so many leaders say, oh, of course it's important to connect, but they don't know exactly what to do. I wanted to have steps in each chapter of what to do to connect with yourself. Yeah. So that first step is own your story. Yeah. And then that second step is give up perfection, because it never works. And then that third step is own your communication style. Yeah. So no matter what inventory you use, and I only use the one just because I developed it on my sabbatical, but take a communication inventory and figure out what your default is. And a lot of people, if I were to interview their family members and say, tell me about Johnny at age 5, how did he prefer to communicate? Typically, it's very similar to how Johnny prefers to communicate now. Yeah. Either he was all about relationships or he was not into it and he was into the bottom line. Yeah. And so once you understand your defaults, then you can, like I was just saying about Pete, then you can adapt all of your communications. I'll give you another example. We even worked on his executive team meetings, changing it up so that it reflected his personality. Pete is an introvert. And he would much rather listen to all of his teammates as direct reports. I was just on a Zoom call with his team meeting yesterday. He spends so much time in that 1 hour and 15 minutes truly connecting and listening to each person, asking them, how are you doing really? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's getting in your way? What can I help you with? And then at the very end, he'll give updates and a call to action. Whereas in the very beginning, most leaders in the organization who are extroverts, they do all the talking. And Pete was exhausted trying to follow that model because it wasn't who he was. It didn't play well to his strengths.
Yeah, beautiful stories. In the second part of your book, you go into the topic of connecting with your team. And there's a chapter titled Show Care and Compassion for the Whole Person. And I like that last part, the whole person. How do we do this successfully and especially authentically? And is sincere interest, and that's the first question. The second part of the question is sincere interest in other people something that we can learn? Because some people simply, their focus is elsewhere. It's not with other people. So is that something we can learn for people who don't have an interest in other people? Really,
I believe so. That's a very great point. I do believe that leadership right now, to be a leader, is hard, very challenging, incredibly rewarding, and it's a lot of responsibility. But I do believe that's the seismic shift in leadership, that this is this human revolution, that if you want to be successful as a leader right now, you got to figure out how to care and show interest in the whole person. And I'll give you an example. I really advocate, particularly because most of our world is on video conference calls like the one we're doing right now, and that's what Pete does. Once a month, he has his executive team meeting over Zoom, and I'd say for the first 20 minutes, he has a different question every time. So it might be a lot of times he says, I want to know how you're doing personally on a scale of 1 to 10 and how you're doing professionally. And each person goes around, and that only works if people are honest, right? And so there's always somebody on the team who says, well, I'm a 3. And that's okay, because it gives other people permission to say, oh, okay, I don't have to be a 9. It goes back to perfection, Julius, right? Oh, I don't have to pretend that everything's perfect. This really happened. This is interesting. So again, I'm on Pete's calls with his team meeting because I usually facilitate and talk to the team, because these are all high level chiefs of a big system. And I'll talk to the team at the end about what I'm seeing, give them perspective. And so this was right when the Delta variant emerged, when we had thought that we were out of it. And this is a hospital system we're talking about. So these are leaders who aren't on the clinical side, they're on the corporate side, but talk about stress. They were losing their revenue streams, elective surgeries were not allowed. Their nurses were burned out and stressed with these COVID units. That was a really tough time. We thought we were out of it, and then exactly. So it was that time, and we're on this call, and some executive coaches had and Adam Grant had talked about this. Some people had been trying to come up with a word to describe how we were all feeling, and they were talking about slogging, that in the military, the way that you feel right now when you don't see an end in sight is it's you're slogging, and the best you can do is just put one foot in front of the other. So we're talking about this, and he said, so I'm going to begin this meeting just asking how you're doing. And we did the 1 to 10, and most of them said 8, 8, 8, 8, 8. And so we went through the business, and then is when I mentioned slogging and inertia and what we're feeling right now. And then the high leader, Pete, said, I got to be honest with you all. I'm having a hard time. This is hard. My children are having to go to college with masks on. I haven't been able to travel and see my friends. All of our people he goes, I'm having a really hard time. So I would now want to go around and really check in with, how are you doing, really? And it changed everything. All of a sudden people were like, this is horrible. But beforehand, they didn't feel like they had permission. And so they were just giving each other, right, an 8 out of 10. So in any case, that example is kind of a convoluted one, but it just shows how important it is for a leader to intentionally embed time in their meetings virtually to connect and say, I see you, I care about you as a whole person. Please note, again, Julius, he doesn't ask, professionally, how are you doing? He's like, what's going on personally with your kids? And one of the other examples he gave me is he said, Michelle, I do this in the very beginning because I want to know, I never would have known that guy on my team, he's an empty nester just like me. His kids just went off to college. Like now, we get to connect. I never would have known that. He said, number 2, by doing it in the very beginning, it's not only good for me because I get a finger on my pulse of my people, but it creates relationships and connectiveness together and that safety together. Because I have some leaders, Julius, who will say, Michelle, I don't want to do that exercise in the beginning of my meeting. I'm the CFO. We're losing money. We got stuff to do. I'm not going to sit there and ask, how are you doing really? And I said, well, you know what? If you don't, you're going to pay high costs because you're not going to have this cohesive team. You're not going to have this psychological safety. You're not going to have trust. Ergo, you're not going to have faster decision-making, increased productivity, increased retention.
Yeah, if people learn that they can actually speak up and be honest, they'll be speaking up and be honest about other things relating to the business also, which is critically important. Yeah.
Leaders have told me that they're scared. They're like, I don't know if I want to open up Pandora's box. Do you really want me to ask how each of my people's doing personally? Yeah. And I said, yes. Yeah. That's the difference now. That's where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the shift to actually do that and incorporate it and make it standard practice, everyday practice. I want to touch upon a classic because building on my previous question, you've learned actually at a very early age in your dad's home office, as I read in your book, from picking up Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than trying to spend 2 years to get people interested in you. And I think this is, as it has been for you, I imagine, an absolute eye-opener and fundamentally true thing that we have to, I don't know, stand still with and really appreciate. Why is it so critically important to do this? And at the same time, why is it so hard for people to learn, to focus on the other person instead of always talk, you know?
Yeah, so many different levels here. I love your questions. Thank you, Julius. So a lot of that seismic shift from power and control to connection really is from the leader as ego and all
Yes.
about me,
Yeah.
to that shift to it's all about you. And that's what, so one of the chapters under connection with team is servant leadership. How do you all of a sudden, when you're used to solving all the problems, doing all the talking, having all the answers, it's a different skill set. I mean, that takes real effort to say, oh, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to make it all about their development. I'm going to coach them. They have the right answers. I'm going to allow them to make mistakes. So that's the shift. Now, the Tippy example, which is the dog example from Dale Carnegie, I really do remember because it was the 70s. That's why I said on gold shag carpeting in my father's office. I remember bringing out and I have the original one. My father dedicated and donated to dedicated to my daughter, and it's in her room now. But I do remember reading that story of Tippy and it absolutely resonating with me because I had just made mistakes in my new city. I had just come from living only 1 year in Nashville, and I had been a cheerleader, and it was this round, big gymnasium, and the whole student body of the high school voted on the cheerleaders, and I remember that I just remember the feeling and the standing ovation, and this particular cheerleading team would go on to win awards, and I had just made it and had this incredible experience, and the pep rallies, amazing. So I'm in my new city now, and that's all I can talk about. In my old high school, pep rallies were in my old high school. And the new people were like, would you stop talking about your old high school? That's not working here.
How's that interesting for us? Yeah.
Right. And and so that's when I thought of back to that Dale Carnegie book, like he was so right. I've got to make it all about these people and their traditions and getting to know them and finding commonality. And I got to stop talking about how great my friends and pep rallies were.
Yeah. It's a huge deal. Yeah.
That's a huge deal. And I've seen it in the classroom, Julia. So again, I've been 22 years as a professor in the College of Business at Loyola. And so many of my former mentors who are all retired now, the advice they gave me was, it was all about the professor. The professor lectured for 3 hours
with the ivory tower. Yeah.
From the ivory tower. It was all about them. It was not about the students. Yeah. And it was kind of a punitive approach. If the students came in late, lock them out. Yeah. If the students misspelled a word, take an entire letter grade off. If, it was an environment of power and control. And I thankfully, I'm seeing the shift in that environment too. It should be about the students. Absolutely. Developing them, doing role plays, experiential exercises, we learn by doing. It's a shift. The ivory tower is shifting. Yeah.
Thankfully, much needed. And great examples. I want to be mindful of the time, but I think we can make it. I have a few more questions. Building on, you have an example of Boise, Donald T. Bullinger, who's the former chairman and CEO of Bullinger Shipyards. And when you ask him about success, his first reply was, first thing he said, listen to your employees, listen to your leaders. And he shared about these listening sessions that he'd held and that he conducted. And when I read it, I was like, oh, that's amazing. I love that. Can you tell me more about these listening sessions and what he shared with you, what you learned from it?
Boise Bollinger was ahead of his time. Absolutely. He realized early on when it's very much, this was the 80s, when it was very much still command and control.
Yes.
CEOs didn't come down to the front line and say, I want to hear your input. What are your opinions? That didn't happen. But he has incredibly high emotional intelligence. And he said he realized that the relationship between his supervisors, this is a shipyard. Mm-hmm. The relationships between the supervisors and the employees were adversarial. He's like, this is not the culture I want. And so he brought in all kinds of leadership development before that was really in vogue. And and then he said, okay, I need to model the way, and I need to come down to every shipyard. I think it was once a year in January, and he would do these listening sessions. He would first give about it was a 1 hour listening session, I think, at each shipyard he would do. He said he would only speak for about 15 minutes just to make sure everybody knew that revenue was good, their salaries were good, that they were in good financial shape, the state of the industry, the state of the company. And then after that, he would open it up, and he wouldn't know. This is cool. He wouldn't even invite the supervisors to those meetings. So he took out the middlemen, and it was just him, the CEO, and the front line. Yeah. And he said, now I just want to hear from you. What are your ideas? What do you think? What could be better? How can we help you? And he said he got the very best ideas, how to change the culture, how to change benefits from those listening sessions.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's again about showing interest in the other person and being sincerely interested in what they have to say. Yeah.
And following up. And so then he would come back and follow up and say, I heard you. Here's what I heard. Here's what I can't do.
Yeah.
But here's what I can do.
Yeah.
And then he'd come back the next year and say, here's what I did.
Yeah. Yeah. And people respect you for it. Also, when you say what you can't do, but what you will do. That's a great point. Thanks for adding that. You speak about alignment also with the organization. Connection with the organization begins when you align yourself, your mission, your goals, and your values, important part, with the organizational values. Actually, for me, this is a very interesting topic because I did 2 masters. I did international relations and then change management, business administration. And for both of my masters, I actually researched vision implementation success. And so I did 36 interviews with CEOs and consultants and everyone working in this arena to identify what actually led to companies being successful in achieving the goals and the vision that they set for themselves, and which ones that didn't, and why. And actually this alignment that you speak about, it came up so many times. So I very much relate with what you find in your book and what you write about. So can you share more about this alignment and why the organizational values are so critical? And what can we do to ensure this alignment between the individuals and the organizations that they're part of?
A couple of thoughts, Julius. Number one, you need to write a book.
Well, I mean, actually, I'm thinking of this 39 Ideas for Life to put it all together in a book. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's my number one. You need to write a book for sure. And no wonder we really speak the same language. You conducted very similar research that I did.
Yeah.
Number two, the two examples, these are both CEOs of hospitals. So it has to do with healthcare, the healthcare industry. Both of these guys, they were both guys, had been working for for-profit hospitals. And it was very much about cut. It wasn't about the people. Yeah. And one of them happened to be on an airplane on September the 11th, 9/11. Huh. And of course, didn't know what was going on, except the pilot came on and said, we have to land immediately. And all of a sudden, the 737 became like a fighter jet and banked severely and landed immediately. And then he got out and realized what had happened with the Twin Towers coming down, and we're now going to be at war and everything has changed, the freedom that we used to know. And he had been on his way to fire more employees. to land to another hospital and lay off people. And just experiencing that 9/11, realizing that's not who he was, it's not who he wanted to be. He had that cognitive dissonance. And so he quit, and he ended up, now he works for a not-for-profit, and that's much more aligned with its values because it's all about the people, the children. Another example in my book, he's the CEO of a children's hospital. And he knew early on, he started off, this is an interesting guy. His name is John Nickens. And he was a real stud in high school and fell for the beauty queen and ended up getting pregnant when they were seniors in high school. And she was supposed to go on to this illustrious singing career. And he had a baseball scholarship, and everything changed. And he said, Michelle, at that moment in my life, I had a big choice to make, right? I could own my story. And he said, and I had to, and it became, and they're my neighbors. They live right around the corner, still married, beautiful relationship, but owning his story became so much. I mean, he never hid pieces of himself. He said, here's who I am, and I'm going to let what happened motivate me. So he was working at a very young age, right? Trying to prove himself. And he was, I think, in the billing department trying to collect the money. And he just so happened to be in an elevator with the CEO. And the CEO said, I need you to get my money. And John said, and I was making all these excuses. And the CEO said, you want to know how what you do is a big deal? And he brought them into the NICU. And he took off John's wedding band. And he put the wedding band on the little leg of a baby in the NICU. And he said, that baby, that is why we need you to collect the money, to keep that baby alive. And it just all became clear. He knew at that moment, this was John was young and motivated in the billing department, that he wanted to be CEO of a children's hospital to help save babies' lives. It just, boom, he knew it.
It's a very powerful example that he made at that point. Yes, it's beautiful. I have 3 more questions. Do we have time for that?
Sure.
Okay, great. You speak of positive culture in your book, and I'm all about positivity in the sense that also in the setbacks, in the negative, supposedly negative experience that we have, actually there's so many learnings to be had if we pay attention. So what makes a positive culture, and how can we create one?
So great example. There's a guy named Todd Graves who's in my book, and he's the founder, president, and CEO of Raising Cane's Chicken Fingers. And so he worked for a chicken finger place at the University of Georgia. And he went to the owners because the lines just went down the street. And he went to the owners. He said, I want a franchise. Like, let's go big. This is huge. And the owner said, no. We're exhausted. We're fine. This is all we can keep up with. So he said, this is huge. They had a secret sauce. He said, I need to open one of these at LSU. So he went and did all these crazy jobs in the summer to raise crazy amounts of money just to open up his one chicken finger place with the secret sauce outside the gates of Louisiana State University, LSU. Well, today, Todd Graves, it is a global brand. They're in Saudi Arabia, all over the world. And he started it as a place where his employees, because he was the same age as his employees, he looked around at the other fast food restaurants. He looked at the uniforms that were polyester. The employees were embarrassed to wear the uniforms. The environments were no fun. There wasn't cool music. There wasn't any joy. And he said, I'm going to change all of that. I'm going to make fast food cool. And he started cool clothes, cool hat, cool music, interact through the drive-through, tell jokes. I mean, it's so funny. My daughter and I, during the pandemic, they were one of the few places that was open. You could go through drive-through, and we would go often. And it's this chicken finger place, and we'd pull up. And the fast food employee, in the drive-through would say, cluck, 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 and then would tell a joke. And I just remember looking at my daughter saying, thank God somebody is adding some levity and bringing some sort of joy to this really tough environment, right? They were still having fun during a pandemic because that was a value. Todd wanted to create a positive culture based on fun, innovation, empowerment. And you know what's cool about that, Julius, is Todd refers to himself on his business card, even though he's the founder, CEO, president, his business card says cashier and fry cook, because he said everybody in the organization is a cashier and fry cook. As a matter of fact, CNN just ran an article on him because you know about the labor shortage, in particular in the restaurant industry. People are not finding people to work. So his entire corporate office was deployed and they're now cashiers and fry cooks.
Literally in the restaurants.
Yes.
That's amazing. Well, I was going to say he's clearly leading by example, which is obviously the way to go. Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. One that is particularly interesting to me also is a question about owning your calendar, which as certainly I know, but I think we all know, it's quite a challenging task to own your calendar. And instead of rather working in a stressful, reactive state of mind where we're always following other people's agendas, you say that leadership plan a cadence of interaction that they have with each of their stakeholders and thereby proactively manage their meetings. So my question is this: how can we do this to proactively manage and schedule our meetings so that these meetings start working for us instead of we always working for our meetings? So
calendar management, whatever you call it. Warner Thomas is in my book, and he's the president and CEO of Auctioner Health. And when I interviewed him, I didn't expect to have a chapter on this. My book is about connection. Yes. I didn't expect that one of the themes would be own your calendar in order to connect with the organization, and yet it makes complete sense.
It does.
As the leader, you have to think about who are the most important stakeholders and how often should you meet with them.
Yeah.
And so Juan Martin was the global president of Kind Bars, was another one that I interviewed for this. He said, Michelle, that's the essence of leadership right there, because that determines all of your communication and connection every day, every week, every month, every year, your cadence, your operating rhythm. But it's on you to figure out who are the key stakeholders, who are the most important, and how often should I be meeting with them. And in addition, Warner says, and Michelle, whenever I meet with him, because I coach a bunch of his leaders, he goes, please, he goes, I'm paying these high-level leaders for their brains, Michelle. Make sure they embed time to strategically think.
Yeah.
Because I'm hearing more and more, they're just complaining and they're reacting. I don't have any time. I have no time. I'm in meetings all the time. He said, well, tell them to book 30-minute meetings instead of 1 hour. Yeah. Tell them to make sure their lunchtime is sacred. Make sure that 3 o'clock every day is your time to creatively think, if that's the best time that your brain processes. Yeah. I mean, that was eye-opening for me.
Yeah. And it is for me too. I mean, it's so obvious and it's in plain sight, yet we don't do it. And also when we speak about connection, obviously when you schedule meetings, you want to connect with them instead of when you're taking part in meetings, which you have to be in because they have been scheduled. I mean, that obviously impedes connection. So yeah, it's I think a very important part of the book. And I appreciate
I've learned a lot. Yeah, I finally got good at this. You know, as a leadership coach, I feel like so much more from my clients. Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing. I remember, you'll get a kick out of this. I remember years ago, I was trying to find with my girlfriend who was a stay-at-home mom. Yeah. And I'm a career woman, and she's one of my best friends. And I said, oh, well, let's get together for lunch on a Monday, next Monday. She said, oh, no. Mondays are my day. I hold them sacred. I don't book anything. Yeah. And I remember thinking, that's amazing. And I learned from that because I wasn't holding any day sacred. And I was running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to be everything to everybody and exhausted because I wasn't owning, nothing was sacred. Everything was about what everybody else wanted. And that wasn't effective.
Yeah, that should be a book in its own right, actually, this topic. Yeah.
We need to write a book together, Julius.
Yeah, actually, I'm thinking about this. I mean, we should connect more and speak more, because this is really something. It's also actually one of the topics that I still want to research. It's how we can simplify this chaos of demands and of meeting events and of topics that we have to deal with. How can, I mean, it comes down to actually owning your calendar, but also owning your focus. Where do we decide to put our attention? Yeah.
I like the way that you articulated that, owning your focus.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's critically important. And I'll be honest, I in many cases, probably the majority of the time, I would say, at least to my standards, I fail at this, because I'm allowing myself to be carried away with the focus of other people and with their agendas. And actually, I'm one of the owners of the company that I work in, and still this happens, you know. So it's absolutely a challenge.
And it leads to dissatisfaction and frustration.
Yeah, and if we speak about your book, it leads to disconnection or disconnect, because we're not really fully present with what we're doing in that moment. Yeah. Right. Last question, and then I'll let you go and enjoy your Saturday. What question about connection? This is actually a question I always ask at the last part of these talks. What question about connection didn't I ask, which I should have asked?
Wow, your questions were very thorough, and you hit on every level that I think connection is. I think my next book is really going to focus, as you talked about in reference, much more about just connection with yourself, connection with your focus, connection with your priorities. Because that is the foundation. I mean, that if you don't have true connection with yourself, you can't be a high performer, anything.
Fully agree.
Right? So we've talked about it. It's not that you didn't ask about it, but I think that, and then I think that other areas of topic for connection, which are important, which I didn't even talk about in my book, are the importance of connection with community.
Yeah.
We've all learned how important community is because it's been taken away from us.
Yeah.
So how can you be an active member of your community and stay connected with that? I think that there's something to that, and I haven't even explored that topic.
Yeah. I appreciate you for saying it. I'll give you back something that comes up when you talk about the connection with yourself, because what I notice and what I see both with myself and people around me, what we have somewhat unlearned, because as a baby we have this ability, but growing up and living our lives, or having our lives lived, if you will, we lose the ability to be in touch with ourselves. I think mostly also the physical element. So I remember that at some point, and this is years ago, a friend of mine said, she said, I don't know what I'm feeling, you know, and even she couldn't feel in her physical body what she was feeling. And we've lost our ability to feel what's going on. And I think this connection with ourselves, when we talk about it and think about it, in many cases, it's actually a mental thing. And what I feel what we need to learn again and learn much more is the physical element of the relationship with our body and how that resonates with our mind. And I think that's a big part of this whole connection
that's
with ourselves.
Huge. And I think the title is Disconnection from Yourself. And this is all, so many neuroscientists are looking through MRI imagings of the brain and how Walter Lieberman out of UCLA, I mentioned him in my book. He wanted to know about, and his book is called, he named his book Connection, because he wanted to learn about pain and what was more painful, physical pain. And he put people through MRI machines with broken bones and compared the brain to people who had emotional pain, who felt disconnected from their families, their partners, their friends, their communities. And social pain is so much more painful and takes so much more space in the brain, right? And so, that connection with your physical self and how it affects your mind, oh my gosh, that's powerful.
Yeah. Hey, Michelle, thanks so much for this talk. It was really great. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Also, again, thanks for the privilege of getting your book as the first outside of your small circle.
I'm so glad you liked it. That just makes my day.
I love it. It's a great book, and I know that many more people will like it. it will take a life on its own. I'm sure of it.
Oh, thank you, Julius. This was a true pleasure. I loved it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with me. I wish you a beautiful Saturday, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
Please stay in touch.
Yes.
I love the way you think. Okay, take care, Julius. Bye.
Yes. Bye, Michelle. Bye.
Bye.